So I've opened up my normal maps in Endu, clicking on the map converter button. I'm converting map to ambient occlusion. So this is just a quick way in this case. It's a possibility of creating your ambient occlusion. So in the previous video, I compiled the different normal maps into a single Photoshop file. If you rendered out individual ambient occlusion maps, you would need to do the same thing. Okay, now I need a color ID map. So I'm creating this in Maya, and it's just a matter of making a couple of Lambert shaders with bright, strong colors and assigning these for each material on your asset that is going to be different material. So for example, the wheels are going to be sort of black rubber. The lids are going to be some sort of plastic, and everything else will be metal. So essentially I've just got three key materials that I'm using that I want in the finished product. So I'm going through selecting all of the faces that I want to be, in this case rubber, and assigning this yellow shader. I've assigned the red to the lid and just checking my reference there, and we can see pretty much everything else is the metallic, the painted metal effect. So it's really just those three shaders. And so I'm just going to leave those grey. Now I'm just using transfer maps to generate a map, but this time I'm using diffuse color map. So you can see what I've done there is actually duplicate the object. So I'm essentially transferring the maps from two identical models. They're a clone of each other. And here's the result inside of Photoshop. So these key colors will be assigned. Now inside of Dedo, if we use that as it is, we can see a few problems. Mainly on the wheels here, you can see the sort of struts on the side are colored. So we just need to clean that up. So inside of Photoshop, I'm just using the magic wand selection, and then using the eye picker to select the color, and just basically manually going through, making sure all those colors are matched. So a quick drag selection, that was a very straightforward cleanup. Okay, so here in Photoshop we can see the different materials that I'm starting with. So I've got my color ID, I've got a specular map, I've got an ambient occlusion, I've got a height map, and a normal map. So the normal map we created by combining the different texture normal bakes out of XNormal in the last video. These other maps basically by using Endu, we can click on selecting our normal map, and with this button here we can go into map converter and convert a normal map to whichever map we want. So for example, diffuse. Once you've selected the map that you want, you click on this button, the create button, and that just runs through a bunch of processes inside of Photoshop automatically and creates a texture map for us. And that's the result that it's giving me. This is a specular map, which you can see is identical to the first specular map that I've created, so I'll just close that one. Now I don't actually need these open, this is just to demonstrate the different textures that I'm using, so I'm just going to close all. Okay, so we don't need Endu, what we do need is Dedo. So click on the little D, which will bring up this menu. And now it's asking for inputs. These are our options for what we can input. It's important to make sure from the calibration profile that we set this to Unity. And so I'm using the Unity 5 metalness feature, which is the standard shader inside of Unity, Unity 5. So the mesh, click on that, navigate to the OBJ. Now the ID map that we just created, open that. And this one gives you a links icon. So I'm just going to click that and set this up now. You don't need to do it straight away, you can do it later, but it's certainly easiest to do when you're starting. And all I'm doing is for each color telling it what material I want that to be. So the yellow, just click on Click on the little square. The yellow I want to be a rubber, so I'm just clicking tire rubber. The red is a plastic, so click plastic. But I want to go in there and click this one. And the grey is metal, and I'm actually going to start with a galvanized metal. So essentially that's just a single material rather than a smart material. Galvanized metal. And click done. Okay, just load up the other maps that we have. So we have a normal map. We have an ambient occlusion. At this point I'll point out that it is ideal in DDO to have an object space normal map as well. That would require going back into XNormal and baking out individual normal maps again, but instead of setting it to tangent space, set it to render object space normal maps. The reason Quixel wants that one is that it's useful for determining direction. As it says here, this map enables you mask. That's missing a word there. This map enables you to mask the direction of weathering effects. So essentially by having this object space map, you can say make everything on the underside darker, or make the top side lighter, or bake things from a certain direction. But I'm skipping that for this stage. I have a height map. This is essentially our diffuse, our color, but we don't have one. A specular map. And I think that's all. So ambient occlusion, height, normal, spec, color, and mesh. So Unity 5, create base. And that will process. Speed up this processing. Okay, so we can take a look in 3Do and see what we've got so far. So it's created our base materials. To navigate in 3Do, it's just clicking off in here to orbit around. You can hold down Shift and actually move the light around if you want to see from one angle the light moving. Just middle click to pan, right click to zoom in and out. Very easy to use. So just taking a look. Obviously the chain is we can ignore, because we're setting that up later individually inside of Unity. Okay, so we've got all our base materials looking good. Pretty much the wheels are done. I'm happy to just leave those at a default rubber tire kind of effect, but the rest of it needs some work. Now, before I move on, I just want to rename these layers so that they make a bit more sense. So if we double click, I'll call that one body. Call this one lid. And tire actually makes sense for that bottom one. So essentially everything that we're doing will be working inside these folders. So to start with, for example, the green plastic. The general effect of plastic is reasonable, but I don't want it to be green. So I'll go into the lid folder. And we can see here these colors. If I left click here, I can change those. I'm going to pick up blue and make it slightly darker. For both the main color and the edge wear. Now on top of that I want some grime. It's just a little bit clean at the moment. So I'll add a new smart material inside this folder. So I click on smart material. It'll ask me, am I sure that I want to make it inside this folder? It'll ask me that when I click on create. I'm just going into the weathering section, into dirt. And I think top soot is a fairly good effect. Actually, I'll try the gunk. Top gunk sounds nice. Click on create. So it's asking me, do I want to make it inside this layer, inside this group, which I do. So I'll hit yes. Let that process. keeping in mind the way I've set up the normals for this is they're mirrored, so I'm seeing that duplicate directly across. So that's a little bit too obvious there for my liking. So I'm not happy with that one. I'm actually just going to hit the delete key and get rid of that layer completely. So it's easy to undo if you make a mistake or if you're just not happy with the result, which is the nature of Quixel. You need to experiment. Before I move on, I'll just save this project. So this arrow here, save project as. So when I save it, what it actually does is create a Photoshop file with its various layers that Quixel is using, plus this XML file. So if I were to make a new file, if it all crashed or if I had to close it down and come back later, it's just a matter of opening Ddo and going load project. And in the folder that you've created, click on the project XML file. That just brings all your materials back to exactly the state that you are in. Okay, so that's reloaded our model. It seems to be getting a strange issue. It's not updating. If you ever get a problem where you're not convinced that 3Do is showing you what you should be looking at, we can see here clearly that's blue, but it's showing me green for some reason. It's the old file. You can click on this little force refresh button. Forces it to just update everything in 3Do. Okay, so I want to add a grime layer to the top of this. So inside my lid, clicking on a smart material, and under the weathering section, I'm going to go with top soot and hit create and see, yes, I do want to make that inside this layer. So let that process and take a look at the results. And that's kind of what I was after. It's just a little bit of sort of noise, sort of giving the impression that it's a bit more worn. So I'm going to call the lid done and just move on to this body. So we'll go to the top layer and into the body group. So all I've got here in the body is the galvanized metal. Now be aware, if we come back to the top layer, this has a mask on it. So this is from the color ID map when we use the links. If I left click on this object, it brings up the mask ID editor. And so you can see from these main sections, it's all the grey bits. What that means is anything inside this group is only ever going to be applied to the metal sections. So inside this group, we've got galvanized metal as the base, which is what I want. And over the top of that, I'm going to make a new smart material. And under metal is painted metals. So I'm looking for basically just something with some scratches. This scratched paint one. Scratched painted metal 05. Has some nice effects on it, so let's try that. Yes, I want this inside my group. Alright, so let's take a look at this this new group. Now the first thing is the metal that it's used is I don't want this metal. So we go back a level. I've got the galvanized metal, that's what I'm wanting. If I just turn off the hide section, that'll update. And so I've got a base layer under there that's still not showing very clearly. But you can see that's made no effect, so we'll just trash that layer. We don't need that. Now this paint, firstly, it's the wrong color. So I left click on the color there, which brings up the color palette. Find something similar to the reference color that I'm trying to match. Be a little bit oversaturated, really. Now, the real problem I'm not happy with this paint is it's 100%. It has no mask. We've got a dirt mask on top, so if I just turn that off temporarily, we can see these dark shadow bits should be disappearing. But really all we're getting is a complete fill. So that's not working very well. The dirt's fine, I like that, but the actual mask on the paint layer needs to be addressed. Okay, I'm going to left click on this mask for the paint layer. I'm just trying making the whole lot black, so it won't be showing any color. And then trying this concrete texture as a mask. Okay, so I needed to bring the contrast right up to get the effect I'm looking for. This button just inverts the selection. So this is what I actually want. The white will be paint and the black bits will be showing the metal underneath. Now I can change the scale of this material. So this is just this concrete texture. And just by experimenting with the positioning of that scale button, it looks like I'm going the wrong way. I'll just try it down smaller. Actually, that's probably too small for what I'm looking for. Okay, so 1 works pretty well. Click on done. Yep, so that's a pretty strong base color effect. We're getting fading from the dirt layer on top. So if I hide that dirt layer, you can actually see the galvanized metal effect underneath it. So what I might do is just clicking on this layer, I'll add a material on top. I'm going with this dusty metal. I'm looking for the surface material effects of this material. So a lot of sort of grime and dirty material, that's very nice. Now the masking for this, probably curvature mask. And on top of that, I'll add the same texture to get rid of the paint scratching that I had down here. So load texture, scroll down to that same cracked concrete 02. And I had the scale up to 2 on that one. So that should position it, was it 2? 1, had the scale up to 1, so that's got the same positioning as this layer here. I'll just click done. So this dusty metal effect should only be on the actual bits that have paint on them. So it has some opaqueness, you can see the blue paint coming through. but probably just want it a little bit more towards the blue. Okay, so that gives it a lot of extra nice details. Very grimy looking material. So look, that's the basic workflow for Quixel. I don't want to get into too much depth of experimentation. I could sit here for an hour and just experiment with the exact same process, just trying new materials on top of the existing materials. It's important to understand that it's experimental in nature. There is no one right way to get the effects that you're after. But you need to know about how the masks work, which we've covered, how the color ID works, and the fact that we're working with layers. So pretty much everything here is within the body layer. So for the next step, I'll actually show a different material that I spent some more time working on. But the next step is essentially Photoshop. So what I'll do is firstly just save this project so we can reopen it and make changes at any time. Okay, so I just need to export this Dedo project. I want to go to the exporter up here. Now this is already set to our Unity 5 calibration, so this will export the exact textures that we need to bring into the standard shader for the metalness setup inside of Unity 5. Now just click on Set Path, and scroll down. I'm just going to make a new folder. You can see there's actually quite a few output files and various attempts that I've done before. The nature of Quixel. Do a lot of experimentation. It's essentially look development. You want to explore the possibilities of different shaders. Just change your settings, so you could change it to something other than map if you wanted to. 16 bits fine. Just double checking that's the path I want, which it is. Now default we need to change. Leaving that's the same as like in a game where you leave it as player 1 instead of changing it to your gamer handle. We don't want this called default, we want it something like dumpster. It's a word that makes sense. Okay, here in Photoshop, I've got this on one layer as you can see, and I've got a selection of images that I've found online and through photos. I will point out again that this base image that I'm using is slightly different to the one that I just created, and yours should be slightly different as well. So I'm just copying and pasting images in. I'm going into levels and just pulling back the brightness. Here's a photo of some graffiti I took. Just using the magic wand to cut out the majority of the color that I don't want. And I'm also putting a blur, so filter blur, just to blur it a little. Copying and pasting into my Photoshop file. And trying some blend modes, sort of darken and multiply type blends will work well. I'm just pasting my UVs and going adjustments, hue saturation, and pulling down the saturation so I can see my UVs over the top. What I've found is that this is actually the front up here at the top. I had them underneath the dumpster earlier. So now that I've positioned them correctly, jump back into Maya just to double check my 3D viewer to make sure that I'm seeing what I want. So a random photo of some yuck splattered against the wall. So copying and pasting that one in. Trying to get a blend mode that kind of works. Mainly interested in the brighter colors. The actual sort of grime. And now I'm just grabbing the eraser tool and setting that down. Currently it's a bit large, but I'm making it smaller as I go. And I will point out I've sped up this section of the video, but I'm just racing through fairly roughly, not too concerned about being precise, but getting rid of the bulk of the unnecessary color And now going fine and just really refining that. So that gives me the general shape I want. Going into hue saturation and colorizing with the hue, pulling the saturation down and making it a bit darker. And so that gives me the general impression of this splat, like it's had something spilt on it at some point. Going through again with the eraser, just pushing it a bit further, a little bit. I'm also duplicating the layer and changing the duplicate, the new layer, blend mode to multiply, and experimenting with the opacity just to make sure it's one layer's a little bit more transparent than the other. They sort of work together to create the effect that I'm looking for. Pretty much experimental, but jumping back into Maya, clicking on the Lambert shader so I can see the result, and more or less happy with that. Photo reference, so a number. Now I want this on the side up here, so I'm just selecting these faces and taking a look at my UV texture editor to see which faces they are, which I can see belong down here. So I'm just pasting this layer, trying to find the right blend mode. Lighter color seems to work well. Now I'm just selecting and hitting Shift-Control-I to inverse the selection and deleting the bit I don't want. And again with the eraser tool, just making some minor manual adjustments. Hue saturation. Finding a more blue color because I don't want it to be green. So just erasing out that edge there to make sure all we're seeing is the text. I'm just copying and duplicating that picture over and changing the blend mode so it matches. And this duplicate just needs a little bit of erasing. So saving that and checking it in Maya, I can see that the numbers are coming through nicely. So I'm just closing off these layers that I don't want. Now this one, it's like a lot of the reference images, it just has a warning notice up in the corner. So pretty straightforward. We'll stick this up here. And I'm just pulling the levels back so it's a little duller. Reduce the opacity just a touch. For now, I'm happy with that. All I really want to do is add a bit of grime manually. So I'm pasting in this grime layer that it's a texture that I've sourced elsewhere. And I'm just scaling it into position to get the effect of the grime that I want. I've just flipped it. So I've Control T to transform the object. Now I've created a mask and I'm using the gradient tool just to make that fade towards the bottom. So we're getting the grime and it's slowly fading away. I've turned the opacity down, I've set it to darken mode, and I've duplicated that layer. So I've got two identical layers on top of each other and just some slight differences. I've then just merged that down. So Control E will merge a layer down into the one layer. So now I'm pasting the original texture back in and I'm repeating that process for a different section of the model. So this is just for the sides. And I'm just deleting, it's very important of course that we delete the sections, any sections that are overlapping other shells, because otherwise we'll see that material come through. I've created a mask. I've run a black and white gradient on it to make it fade away. And experimenting with my blend modes to get the effect I'm after. With this sort of effect, I usually do end up duplicating the layer so that you have a little bit more power to strengthen the effect. I actually just collapsed. What happened there was I collapsed a couple of layers and I wasn't happy with how they were blending into each other, so I left them as two separate layers. Okay, so now that I've applied that to all sides of the model, I'll just check it in 3D and make sure it's working. So it's looking good on the front and the sides. I just need to add it to the back. So just checking which faces they are in my UV editor, which are down here. And same as before, just paste this texture. Try to get a little bit of variety so we don't have the exact same positioning of that texture each time. Reducing opacity, darkening or multiplying playing with the blend mode basically to get the effect that looks good. And then using a mask, which I haven't applied yet, just still experimenting with blend modes. So I actually didn't use a blend mode on this one. I didn't use a mask for the back. I've actually just got the whole texture covering the entire model. So at the back we've got a much more significant amount of the grime streaking down the model. Okay, so just save this out, ready for Unity. So I'm saving this as the albedo. So now I'll bring all of that into Unity. Now to start with the chain, I just want to demonstrate this is the chain according to the UV layout. But what's important is that in the channels we have an alpha channel. So this is actually saved out as a Targa, which saves our alpha nicely. Make sure it's a 32-bit, which keeps the alpha channel. So that gives us the transparency. And on top of that, we've got the normal map. There's no alpha in the normal. So basically, I'm just importing two textures only for the chain. Okay, so just back in Maya, I've got the chain selected on its own. I'm just going to combine that and center its pivot. And we'll export that out as a chain. And for the rest of the mesh, make sure the chain's not selected, center its pivot. Before I do that, let's combine it. Combine, center pivot. And so that doesn't have a chain on it. Export selection. I'll export this one as an FBX. So I've got a folder that has all of the content that I've created for this process, and we just need to bring all of this into Unity. So I'm just going to drag select the whole lot and drag it in. Now you'll notice to start with I actually had a couple of materials in here. I've got a textures folder, which in it has a couple of textures. These are cliff textures. They're actually the height and the normal maps don't actually relate to the albedo, but that's fine. It's an interesting effect that it generates anyway. In addition, I've got skies. So here under the daytime folder is the sky texture. Now, all of this is directly from Unity Technologies. It's free content that you can get on the asset store. So you can grab this and bring that in to set up your scene. And that's basically what I want to do before I start is just change it from the procedural skybox that it gives you by default. So this is procedurally generated. It gives us a sun, which is actually in line with the directional light. So we're getting light shining in the same direction from where the sun is. So it's quite a useful scene. But basically what we want to do is just set up our global illumination. If you go into Window, Lighting, this is our environment lighting system. I'm just going to dock this over here. So by default, we've got our default skybox in there. And if you bring in this sunset skybox, you can just drag that over, and that just gives us a much more interesting look. I'm just checking our settings. I'll just change this to unlimited CPU usage. I can make it run a little quicker. And I'll double the atlas size for the global illumination. It's set to auto, so it's automatically going to build whatever's in there. So basically this is where you set up your skybox system inside of Unity 5. Alright, so I'm going to bring the dumpster in, set this to 0, tab 0, tab 0, so we're in the center of the world. Hit F to focus on that. And because the light is behind it, I'm just going to rotate it a little, try and show off a single side. And the chain, so that's just these faces. I'll just set those to the middle of the world. I'm not sure why that's come in. It's acting like there's a pivot point off in space, even though the pivot point is centered around where I chose. It's a bit odd. But in any case, it's not a big deal. I'm just positioning it where I need it to be. And once it's done, we'll just make a prefab out of that, so it's always at that location. Okay, now we'll parent this under the dumpster, so it's all one object. It all moves together. And I will clean up these materials in a moment and put them in the textures and materials folder, but to start with, let's just make our materials. So I'll make one for the chain, which is a very simple one. We're just applying an albedo and a normal. Fix now, so it is set to a normal. I just want to check that albedo. Yep, so that has got a alpha texture on it. We need to just set that to alpha is transparency. There we go, so we're seeing the transparency on the chain. I'll just apply that. Got a leftover node there from, I think that was from when I brought in the dumpster earlier. Doesn't matter. This chain we want to apply to the model. This needs to be set to transparent. I'm not getting full transparency though. It's coming through with a bit of fading. Potentially that's because of the smoothness. There we go. So yeah, that gives us the chain effects, and that's pretty much all that is. Very simple. Create a material called dumpster. Now this one's, we're using metalness, which is the standard shader setup. And we just plug in each material that we've got. I might start by just applying the shader so we can watch the materials appear as we put them in. So the albedo. The metalness. Gives a bit of a shine. The normal map, which we need to set to normal. So the texture is not set to a normal map until we click Fix Now. So that's giving it a lot more of its normal detail. Ambient occlusion. We can dial that back if we decide it's too strong, but it tends to look alright. Okay, so it's basically the finished asset there. And what we're seeing is a lot of reflection of the environment around it. And that's the whole concept, really, of PBR, physics-based rendering, which is the setup for the standard shader, is that it mimics the world around it. So if we were to set up a game with this to be dark, we'll see, nighttime. We'll see the dumpster and any material that's set with the standard shader reflecting that light realistically. Now, in order to get all that working, there's a couple of things. So this dumpster needs to be set to static. Yes, change children, which will change everything underneath that node. And we just need to make sure that this is set to building. So basically this will only build whatever is in our scene set to static. The main thing is actually the color space should be set to linear. So it gives it a more accurate representation of our PBR calibration. I just want to set up a little display because it's currently just floating in space. So I'll just create a cylinder. I'm just going to make this basically a little display stand. And I'll create a material. And I'll use these Unity cliff shaders. So it's mainly that albedo that's doing the work, but I'm just going to also add these textures, so the normal map just gives it that nice bumpy detail. What I'd like to do to the camera is just add some image effects to make this look nice. So I'm going to import effects, which is the image effects that I want. I'll just import everything. So it's this render down here that we want. Potentially I could set this up as a turntable render, so I could have the camera animating a circle around it, which might be a nice effect. But generally, anytime you present your game assets, they really should be presented in a real-time renderer. You'd never present real-time assets designed for a game engine. You'd never present those pre-rendered in like Maya. It always needs to be a real-time renderer. That's just the industry standard. You want to make sure that you spend a little bit of time making your renderer look nice. And basically we can just add a few image effects to our camera. I'm just going to, now that I've imported my image effects, go through, add component. Or just a depth of field to start with. So visualize icon. Okay, that seems to be about right. We're just getting a little bit of blur. It's like the focus is over here. I'd like to add a slight fog to it, not too strong. Somewhat subtle, just give it a bit of sort of atmosphere. Okay, bloom. Bloom's always a nice one to add. You can see what that does is really push the highlights to an exaggeration. I'll just increase it just a tiny bit so we can get just a little bit of crossover of light coming through on the model. And, this is just purely judgmental, experimental sort of stuff. You just have to make a call on how far you want to push it or not too far. Generally, subtle's a better way to go. So there's a range of color correction options. It's usually worth pushing things just a little bit. I'd like to just increase the blue a little. Just a little. I will leave that down at 0. Just increase that ramp a little bit more sharply. So I'm pulling down the red just a touch. And I'll pull down the green just a touch. Might try a vignette. So it just does this vignette effect. I'll bring it in fairly strong to start with, and then we'll blur that out. So blurred corners. So that's actually blurring the whole model, the whole scene. You can distort that significantly, but we don't really want to do that. I've lost a fair bit of the colour, mainly through the colour correction, but also a bit of that vignette. I'll just come back to the bloom and push that up a little. Probably also need to add just a bit of a fill light, which I'll do with a point light, just in front of the model. And I think I'll colour that just a bit blue. Actually, it's kind of nicer going into these warmer hues. Can add a noise and grain. Definitely want to be subtle on this one. You push it too far, you get a pretty crazy effect. So it's just giving us the effect of some material over the lens, like we're looking at an actual camera almost. And I think basically that's probably about what we would want. Actually, an anti-aliasing would be nice. It's just sharpening up some of the image. I'll just bring this above. Oops. Click on this one, move up. So that's above. So basically that's happening before we do all the noise and grain. Just moving those up a little bit. Okay, I might actually just get rid of the noise and grain completely. Remove component. And what I'll add to try and get that effect of a very grainy, noisy kind of camera, screen overlay under other. And so this is looking for a texture. I've brought in this image now on my camera. I'm attaching that texture to the texture slot, and by default that just kills it, but we've got blend modes just like in Photoshop. The multiply one seems to work pretty well as long as you turn up the intensity. So by default you can see exactly what it's doing. It's just simply put that texture over the whole model, the whole scene, and if I turn up the intensity I get my scene back. And with that bloom script up here, that's definitely getting overblown, but it's not killing the front image. So it's like we're getting a sort of sunset type image. Now this is definitely overkill, mainly to illustrate what you can do with a little bit of effort put into image effects. But at the end of the day, this asset is a dumpster. It's something that would be very dirty and grimy. So presenting it in a very dirty and grimy kind of way, well, it kind of works. So just always think about how you want to present your work. Add a couple of lights if necessary. So I've made that warmer and I've turned the intensity up. Just need to be careful not to overblow it too much. So the light's catching on the chain there, which kind of helps. But yeah, that's pretty much the process. So that's a completed game asset in Unity with physics-based rendered shaders and a collection of image effects attached to our asset. You could set this up to render. If you wanted to do a 3D animation, you could have a camera orbiting around, which would work quite nicely. But basically, this is the general concept that you should be following to present your work inside the game engine that you're most experienced in, which in this case is Unity. So thanks for watching these videos. I hope you learnt something, and keep an eye out on this channel for further tutorials down the track. Cheers.